Uh, Hi. I always start videos off like that, but I usually say, hello. But yeah, anyway, I'm gonna talk about some things. Put that down because it makes a noise on the camera, on the phone. Um, is philosophy a pointless subject? Sometimes I feel like it is, because it doesn't seem to be very practical. It's all pretty much theoretical, it's all in your mind, it's all thoughts and articulation of, I guess, thoughts. But yeah. But does it have a purpose? And this is sort of a point I want to maybe discuss a little bit in this video. So I would say that philosophy does have a purpose, because often it's the thoughts that we have which lead on to understanding the world in many different ways. So it's like it might have started off with philosophy, but then philosophy progresses on to science, and then science obviously progresses on to more understanding about the world. But if we didn't initially have an interest in thinking about the makeup of the world and why things are the way they are, then there would be no science, because everything starts from ideas, and that's essentially what philosophy is. So it's almost like philosophy is a gateway into other fields of knowledge, I guess. So I would say philosophy definitely has some importance, and we could even argue that it has a lot of importance, because we shouldn't assume that we've already discovered all of the different ways to perceive the world, and all of the different means of I guess testing the world and finding out if our knowledge of the world is actually truthful. I think that's going to keep on evolving the more that society and technology and human thought keeps on evolving. So I think philosophy is always going to have a place in the world. But I'm not sure if philosophy is actually an end in itself. I feel like it's more of a means to an end. So, for example, you have philosophy, like in ancient Greece, let's say, and then that philosophy is what led on to um, other other areas of expertise, such as science, and then science obviously breaks up into multiple different domains of expertise, which are all distinctive in their own way. So you've got biology, chemistry, physics, and I guess you could say psychology, sociology, if you want to consider those as scientific endeavours. And I would say that all of those have roots in philosophy. So I think philosophy is overly criticised. People say that it's pointless, and often when you say that you're interested in philosophy, you often get judged. And I would say that that's more common in the modern world, because we have things like science, and science seems to be a pretty valid and reliable uh, lens to perceive the world through, and to be able to work out exactly what the world's all about. However, science only really looks at the physical aspects of the world. Perhaps there's more to the world than just what meets the eye, or just what we can test with scientific equipment. And maybe there is a great importance to actually thinking about things. And obviously, I think the lines get a bit blurred there, because it's like, how do you define philosophy? Is philosophy just how you think about things? Is it just what you think about? Because if that's the case, then anything can be considered philosophy. Can just It can be quite a broad label, but I would say that philosophy is encompassed in everything that we do on a day-to-day basis, or at least we have almost underlying philosophical principles of which we predicate our behaviours on, and I think most of us do it unconsciously, and I certainly do it unconsciously for the majority of the time, apart from when I'm sat speculating about what's going on in my mind exactly, and just trying to actually figure things out. But most of the time we'll just be sitting around, maybe we'll be watching a bit of TV, but then it's like, what drives us to watch the channels we watch and watch the content we watch? There must be some sort of interest there which is driving us towards that, and is that directed by some sort of underlying philosophical principle like I've just mentioned? And I don't quite know what that principle could be, but it could be something that we're interested in. But I don't know if a principle is necessarily an interest. However, an interest might be driven by a principle, but what creates that principle exactly? I'll say we have values and we have belief systems and we have ways of looking at the world, and these values and belief systems and perceptions, I guess you could call them, they almost drive our actions in certain ways. So if we have a belief that skateboarding is the best thing ever created or discovered or whatever you want to call it, then we're probably going to gravitate towards that particular way of life, I guess, where we may sit and watch skateboarding videos for hours on end. We may even go out and try and learn how to skateboard so we can become the best possible skateboarder in the world, or maybe we'll have a little bit of less of a narcissistic goal. But you get the idea. There's a principle which is driving that action, and that principle is almost like, well, maybe there's an even deeper principle than just skateboarding is great. Maybe it's just like you've got to do something which is great and meaningful, or you've got to do something which is challenging, and maybe that's what drives you actually to like skateboarding, because it's challenging. And then I'm sure you could have applied that to an infinite number of things. Like maybe you'd say, oh, I like skydiving, or I like tightrope walking, because those things are challenging, they're difficult for me, and it makes life almost feel meaningful. So that drives us towards doing certain activities. But then I guess the reason we may gravitate towards certain activities is just due to exposure. So I'll stick with the skateboarding thing. So we might see people doing all these crazy tricks, like, I don't know, jumping down, doing like a kickflip off 15 stairs. And we're like, whoa, that is really cool, because it looks hard. It's difficult. It's not easy for those people to do it. Maybe if they were doing it off one step, it's like, yeah, right, that looks alright. It looks pretty fun. I could probably do that, but it wouldn't necessarily be very meaningful, because it's not extremely difficult. And it's that difficulty which almost drives us towards it, because we want to be able to accomplish that for ourselves, because we know it'll make us feel good, or at least it'll make us feel like we've actually done something of some sort of value. And obviously that value is determined by the social judgments of that particular activity. So I'm not someone who skateboards myself, but I really enjoy watching people who skateboard on YouTube, because I just think it's amazing what people can do when they really put their mind to something. But anyway, I was talking about the exposure. So it's like we have a drive to do something which is bigger than ourselves, or at least perhaps that's what we ought to have. It makes us feel inspired. And then if we get exposed to a skateboarding video, then maybe we'll find, then maybe we'll try to implement skateboarding into our own lives, so we can try and accomplish the things that we see being accomplished by the people on TV. We try to embody that almost. And if we'd perhaps seen a typeroping video, or a BMX video, or someone solve one of the hardest maths equations ever written, then we'll be driven towards those sorts of activities. But I think it is probably partially temperamental. Like if we're sporty, then maybe we'll be driven to do things which are difficult in a sporty manner. So it might be football, skateboarding, anything within the domain of physical activity. Whereas if we're a little bit more intellectually inclined, then maybe we'll try to pursue that difficult endeavour, maybe in a more, perhaps you might go to university and study a difficult subject which you have interest in. So it could be like physics or English or philosophy, I don't know. And then you'll pursue it that way. But I guess it is still the same underlying principle which drives all that. And is that principle philosophical? I don't know, because but again it depends how you define philosophy. If philosophy is just thoughts and what people think and why they think, I'm struggling to talk about that because I think there's a big overlap between philosophy and other fields of expertise such as psychology and science and and sociology, because philosophy is essentially the underpinning of, or at least it's, I've got to refer to it as the prime mover of these other fields of knowledge, because it was the initial thinking about things which actually drove people to progress in thinking about certain areas and developing a completely different field. But the initial point was thinking and asking questions, and that is a very philosophical thing to do. So I don't think you can necessarily escape the philosophy. So I think even though science has become rather divorced from philosophy in many ways, it there's still almost a philosophical essence prevalent in science, because it was the philosophical methods which were used initially in order to drive scientific discoveries forward. Um, so I would say everything is philosophical to an extent, and I guess that is sort of coherent with the ancient Greek idea of philosophy, whereby the mind is almost what distinguishes us from other animals. So people like Plato and Aristotle would say that reason is what makes humans humans. It's what we should strive to be. We should strive to be reasonable, because that is ultimately good and it will lead to eudaimonia, or human flourishing. So, and I think there is a lot of coherency to that, because like I was saying earlier, like we can strive to do things which are extremely difficult and in order to accomplish things, whereas you don't necessarily always see that with other animals. I'm not saying it never happens, because there is a lot of intelligent animal species out there, such as octopuses, who can solve extremely complex puzzles, and also I think apes are able to solve solve puzzles as well, which means that they do have the capacity to think, but I'm not sure that they have the same capacity to have goals in the same way that we do. However, I'm perhaps being a bit presumptuous there, because I guess we can't know, because we can't go inside the mind of an octopus or the mind of a gorilla and discover the way in which it sees the world. However, we might be able to get close to discovering the way it perceives the world through the means of observation and observing their behaviour, and see if there's any sort of patterns. And then if there is a pattern, then maybe there is some sort of thought process which is actually driving the way that they're driving the way that they're perceiving and acting in the world. So yeah. So I don't think philosophy is pointless. I feel like it's always going to have a place in the world. Like, I can't see how it wouldn't. I think it would almost be arrogant to say that it wouldn't have a place in the world. However, you could argue that philosophy was like the starting point. Obviously, it wasn't the start, but it was the starting point for many of the fields of knowledge we have today. Philosophy then leads to, say, psychology. Psychology then leads to other fields of knowledge within psychology. So it could be like cognitive psychology, behavioural psychology, childhood psychology, and criminal psychology, and all of these different domains of psychology. Are those domains necessarily philosophical? Like, were they derived from a philosophical basis, or were they derived from the initial study of psychology, which was derived from philosophy. So just because psychology itself may have been derived by philosophy and asking questions about the human mind, does that necessarily mean that the things which were derived from psychology are philosophical? And I think that's debatable. However, I think that we are still using philosophical means in order to be able to derive those different domains. Because it would require further thinking, and also with a mixture of scientific observation in order to be able to, discover almost these different domains of psychology. I had a point, but it's gone. It was sort of about evolution, and it's similar to the point I was just making. So, this is the part where I can't remember the initials. Okay, so we'll say that evolution is true, which I believe it is, because I think there is substantial evidence to support the theory. So we evolved from little pieces of bacteria, which were maybe floating around in the water right at the beginning of time. I would say the beginning of time, actually. I'd say after the Big Bang killed the dinosaurs, even though I know that the Big Bang is sort of a contentious theory, but I'm not fully sure of the reasons because I'm not an expert on science, and I'm nowhere near an expert on science. But anyway, so those bacterias, they evolved into more complex creatures, and over time they evolved into more human-like creatures, and I can't remember what these were called. But it was like the first humans, and then those humans evolved further and further and further until eventually we got to the point we are today. Is that initial bacteria still prevalent in our being today? Does it still have significance? And that I don't know. But I think the point I'm trying to make is, if philosophy is almost like the bacteria which evolved into other domains of expertise, into more complex fields of knowledge, let's say. So is the philosophy still prevalent in those things? And I want to say it is. See, I think it's probably adapted and changed, but it's still essentially philosophy. It still involves the same thought process that that philosophy initially involved using. And I'm going to say the same about the bacteria, which evolved over a span of, I want to say, millions or billions of years, to become more complex organisms like human beings. I want to say that bacteria is still somehow prevalent within humanity today. However, I think it may have adapted and changed, and that's essentially the process of evolution. But it still has a significance. We couldn't just rid that from the world back then, because otherwise we wouldn't still be around. We wouldn't be around today, or at least not in the same way. I'm sure that other things would have evolved through the means of natural selection and survival of the fittest. And maybe we would have had a completely different species, which were, I'll say, at the top of the food chain. But maybe we wouldn't be the same creatures we were today. But I think, so I'll conclude now because it's like almost 20 minutes. I think philosophy still has significance. I think philosophy will always have significance. I think it's going to adapt and change in many ways. But that doesn't mean it's not ever going to have a place in the world, and maybe it won't have a place in the world in the same way that it has a place in the world today, or in the same way that it had a place in the world in the 20th century or the 16th century or ancient Greece. It probably won't play the same role because the world is constantly changing. We're in, I think you call it a state of I think Marx referred to it as praxis, and it's the idea that history is always changing, and we can actually cause it to change, but I don't know if that's completely relevant right now. But the world is always changing, so the means in which we use to look at the world also have to alter and change alongside the world. So that'll mean that the philosophy that we have will change, or the way in which we use philosophy will change. And that's just inevitable, but it doesn't mean that philosophy is not going to have some sort of significance in the world. And also, I guess it raises questions about God. Like, we don't know whether God does exist or not, and that doesn't mean that there's an equal possibility of God both existing and not existing. And I think Richard Dawkins talks about this in his book, The God Delusion. He says something derogatory about agnostics who are completely on the fence. They're like, oh well, we can't know, so it's like it's equally likely. But yeah, that's probably a topic for another video. So yeah, I think philosophy will always have significance, just in a different way that it does today, and in a different way it has in the past. And I'll leave it there because it's a pretty long video. So if you've enjoyed, then leave a like and subscribe. And yeah, thank you for watching.